There we go. Oh, now I'm in trouble. Shoot. Leave it to me to mess it up. Some artists like Caravaggio use a combination of soft and hard edges. Can you guys see that? So like when you're dealing with really representational art or naturalistic art, art that is meant to look realistic, as this Caravaggio painting does, you really need to have a combination of hard edges and soft edges to make that figure feel like it's in the ground. Does that make sense to everybody? Is that any better? So shapes, like lines, can have their own quality. And of course, that's because of their relationship or contrast with the picture plane, which is very static because of its rectilinear quality. Shapes, of course, can be rectilinear or curvilinear and still fall into what we would call a geometric quality category. And again, rectilinear shapes are chiefly horizontal, vertical, or diagonal, whereas curvilinear shapes are closer to the circle. So this example of postmodern architecture has both rectilinear and curvilinear shapes, right? But it's very geometric in its quality, right? Very architectural. This painting by Piet Mondrian is all rectilinear form shapes that are squares, rectangles. Whereas this painting by Natalia Ostapenko is predominantly curvilinear. And it feels a little more natural because of its curvilinear quality. But I would still classify it as a geometric painting. Versus organic shapes, which are lines that don't have the mathematical symmetry quality that we see in geometric forms. Not that all geometric forms have to be symmetrical. Certainly these Paisley shapes here are not symmetrical, but there is a lot of symmetry in this image, yes. Versus what we would classify as organic or biomorphic tend to be more asymmetrical in their quality, more irregular, and they're going to feel more like life. But within organic shapes, you can have shapes that are more rectilinear and shapes that are more curvilinear. It's the irregularity of the pattern of those shapes or the boundaries of those shapes, the lack of symmetry that makes them feel organic. Does that make sense? So that's a rocky organic quality. That's a plant-like or biological versus a mineral type of organic quality. And of course, there are painters who exploit biomorphic organic shapes in their work. This is Arshile Gorky. So, you know, these shapes feel somewhat similar to these shapes, right? Look back. Right? But because their total arrangement is more irregular, not patterned in a symmetrical fashion, they feel more natural. So these are squares, but their irregular edges, the lack of symmetry, the softness of the edges makes them feel more organic. Does that make sense? So if I compare this painter with this painter, I think the distinction between a geometric quality and an organic quality becomes much clearer. Does that make sense to everybody? Caden, are you sure you've got that squint? So it's like a spectrum, right? So you've got the two poles of geometric and organic, and you know there are organic shapes that are more reminiscent of geometric shapes, and there are geometric shapes that are more reminiscent of organic shapes. We want to create two images where one is definitively geometric and one is definitively organic. Does that make sense? So like the last image or project, we're going to have two fields on our Bristol. The left will be geometric and the right will be organic. So that's qualification number one. I just said that. So that idea of a unified geometric form and a unified organic form is what we're going for. But of course, we want variation in scale or size. We want variation in contrast by different types of organics within the organic side and different types of geometrics in the geometric side. Does that make sense? We don't want them all to be the same, because then they are like, too much this, which is boring, right? So all the same ideas that we talked about in the previous project can be pulled forward into this one, including closure, orientation, etc. And we'll get to that in a moment. Now, in this project, we're going to move from kind of free-for-all compositionally into more specific types of composition. In this project, we'll be having an open composition, the other type being a closed composition. So this would be a closed composition where everything's contained within the picture plane. This would be an open composition because things are being cropped by the edge of the picture plane. Now, these are not examples of this project. They're just examples of open versus, or sorry, closed versus open composition. Is that clear to everybody? Now, the other thing that this project, so far, geometric, organic, but both need to exhibit what's known as the figure ground reversal. Figure ground reversal. So we've got the white of our page and the black of our paint, which are the two highest contrasts that you can find within a black and white image. Okay. Technically, even in a color image, black and white are the most polar opposite that you can have. Depending on the shape, size, and location, it can be clear that there's black shapes on a white background or white shapes on a black background. And we're going to play with a type of compositional arrangement that kind of makes that confusing. So items that are close together, as we've seen in the previous project, are likely to be perceived as part of the same group. In the figure ground reversal, the tension created by the contrast of black and white causes the eye to get confused about what's figure and what's ground. So you've all seen this example, right? So because of the relationship of the two white halves and the black half, we can't tell whether it's a black vase on a white ground or two white faces on a black ground. This would be another example where we can't tell whether this is two faces of animals, a gorilla and a lion, looking at each other, or is it a tree with birds and it's against a white background. One of my favorite artists who did this was M.C. Escher. And you can see how when the shapes are farther apart, the negative space becomes clearly just background. But as they get together, their proximity decreases. Does that make sense? Instead of being farther apart in proximity, they're closer together in proximity. Then all of a sudden, that negative space starts to become its own shape. Does that make sense? And of course, he plays with that by using line and texture and detail to gradually switch us from a bird against a white background to a fish against a black background, or vice versa. We're running out of time. So it looks like you probably will only have a little bit of homework. Here's the same thing, with devils and angels. And you see how your eye flips back and forth between what it wants to read. If you're a good person, you probably only see angels. If you're bad, you probably only see this.
What is it? The ink
Just
test?
teasing. A Rorschach test, yeah. That kind of is the same thing. Now here he's added a third color. My eye still goes to the white ones first, though, because the black and the orange are closer in value than the white is. So it stands out more. So we're going to repeat some of the shapes in order to create unity, as I discussed earlier, but we also want to have variations. One of the ways that we can create variation is through the change in scale. So anytime you create a variation of a repeated shape, you're moving into what we call rhythm. And that moves us from a very static pattern like this, which is boring. And you can, are these black shapes on a white background or white shapes on a black background? Yeah, it'd be hard pressed for you to tell which was which, if you even read it that way. You know what I mean? But it's boring. Change the scale. It's still 50-50, right? 50% black negative space, 50% or black space, 50% white space. But because of that shift in the thickness and from a square into a rectangle and from big to small, what do we get? We get a sense of a curving space, right?
It looks like an open book. Like, you know how pages?
Yes, like this. Yeah. This is another interesting one. And like the Lewitt, it kind of vibrates a little bit. And this one really vibrates. But you see how it gets from thicker to thinner as it goes back. And the reason why it's doing that to your eye is because your eye is vibrating. It's trying to decide whether to read black on white or white on black. So the image is not vibrating, your eye is vibrating. So, here's a good example of, are these white shapes against a black background or black shapes against a white background? We can't really tell. And notice that this goes from bigger shapes to smaller units to even smaller units. So there's like 3 experiences of size or scale. These are very geometric forms versus this, which is more rectilinear, but arranged in a more organic pattern. So this is what I want you to do, because we're about to run out of time. I want you to, and we'll look at the images later, I want you to do 5 shape studies for each design, just the shape studies. I want you to come up with 5 different geometric shapes and 5 different organic shapes. So that's a total of 10 shapes on one page in your sketchbook. You don't have to fill them in unless you want to. You can just draw them with line. So don't read this part, just this part. 5 shape studies, for each design. Does that make sense? And I'm kind of glad that I didn't get to show you the student examples yet. You just we breezed past them, because I want you to come up with your own. But 5 geometric shapes and 5 organic shapes. No thumbnails. Do you hear me? How many thumbnails do we have to do? None. How many shapes do we have to do total? 10. How many of organic? How many of geometric? Is everybody clear with that? Are they representational? No, they're non-representational. That's really important. Are we good? All right. What was your question?